On behalf of the Old State House and the Archives, we welcome you to this commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Arkansas State Constitution. I'm Samantha Ashley. I am the curator here, and I am going to introduce Mr. David Ware to get you guys started. So thank you all for being here today.
At any rate, thank you all for coming out this morning on a morning that is marked by a marathon in North Little Rock, interstate closures, and the Hillcrest Harvest Festival, which has thoroughly coagulated traffic in central Little Rock. You're a brave crowd, and we thank you for coming out. My name is David Ware, and I'm afraid that I am probably mostly to blame for what we've been doing over the last few weeks. That is, taking pieces of the Arkansas Constitution of 1874 out around to literally the four corners of the state, Powhatan, Washington, the Shiloh Museum up in the northwest corner, and then Helena on the weekend just before the King Biscuit Blues Festival. We were hoping that we would get a bunch of bearded, denim-clad biker blues fans who'd also turn to be Constitution nerds. I don't think it quite worked out that way. We've had school groups, we've had homeschoolers, and people come in saying, I didn't know Arkansas had a real constitution. Which points up why we're doing this. Back last spring, in the room just above us, the second House chamber, we held an event called Anarchy in Arkansas, trying to make sense of the Brooks-Baxter War of 1874, the great punch-up between rival factions of the Republican Party in Arkansas, which led to demands for a new government, basically a hard reset, Control, Alt, Delete, just following the blue screen of death. For civil politics in Arkansas, which led to the drafting of this Constitution, which was ratified in an election on October 13th, 1874. We had the Anarchy in Arkansas event, and we figured it deserved a follow-up. If for no other reason than, as my colleagues and I have found going around the state, people may be sort of faintly aware that there is a constitution for Arkansas, but they don't know what the heck is in it. If they know anything about it, they know that it's the thou shalt not document. And then they don't know anything else. They don't know where it is. I can tell you where it is. It's in the vault right across from my office at the State Archives, along with our other four constitutions and the Quapaw Treaty of 1824. And my main job as state historian is to, in case of fire or flood or other emergency or special session, I grab those documents and I get out of the building as fast as I can. I think, perhaps, though, what has driven me more than anything else to try to kid my colleagues here at the Old State House and at Historic Arkansas Museum, whose director is sitting over there, trying to pass for one of the rest of you in the audience. Thank you, Stephanie, for showing up. Is something that I witnessed back in my early years working in the state capitol, where I was historian for 19 years on a one-year temporary job. I'm a successful historian after all. Occasionally, when I was pressed into giving a tour, we would be ambushed by the lieutenant governor, Win Rockefeller, who loved talking with tour groups and loved particularly talking about the U.S. Constitution. Invariably, he'd send one of his guys down to his office, and they'd come back with a handful of pocket-sized U.S. constitutions. And Win Rockefeller, as somebody who was among his other occupations, a car dealer, he would explain to these groups, read the Constitution. It's like buying a new car. You have to read the manual. This is the manual for government. Before you think you can drive the government, you've got to read the manual. You've got to know what the bits and pieces are. He said it much more eloquently, but he said it with such fervor, I suspect that some of the kids who went home with those constitutions took him seriously. He was talking about the U.S. Constitution, but it's no less true for the state constitution. Our state's constitution is notably long. It is the fifth attempt to come up with a fundamental document for government. It's been amended 102 times, which is far fewer times than, say, the Constitution of the great state of Texas, our southwestern neighbor, but we will not make jokes at their expense. There have been several attempts in the 20th century to replace this Constitution with one that's a little more suited to the era of inside plumbing and working telephones. These attempts have all gone down to less than success because apparently the people of Arkansas are nervous about what they might get if they tried to improve on this document. Instead, it's been amended 102 times. The first time in 1884, just a decade after its adoption. But it's worth making a fuss about, worth drawing attention to. Even if we don't have 120 people here, even if we don't have folks hanging from the rafters, if we make a fuss about the Constitution and keep repeating it, eventually the word gets out. Eventually we get people to look at our Constitution, understand it, understand something about why Arkansas is the way it is, why the government works the way it does, why we need to amend a Constitution to provide for specific locations for 4 casinos in the state, but we may not solve that mystery today. But it's worth looking at. And so, Win Rockefeller, wherever you are, I hope you're taking note of this. I'm trying to follow in your footsteps. So, we have a collection of lawyers and historians in one room. What could go wrong? With such as the ones who will follow me, nothing. Our first speaker this morning is Herr Dr. Professor Patrick Williams of the University of Arkansas. Sorry, my Germanic friends got me hooked on that usage. He is the Department of History at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. He has a BA from the University of Texas, PhD from Columbia University. He's the author of Beyond Redemption, Texas Democrats After Reconstruction. That should have like a true confessions art treatment on the cover, it sounds like. He is the esteemed editor of the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, and he is known for, at the annual meeting of the Arkansas Historical Association, giving the financial report and pointing out that we get more convention for less money than any other historical society in the state. Teaches Arkansas in the Southwest, modern U.S., the history of political parties in the United States, and he's going to set the baseline for today, talking about Reconstruction in Arkansas. Professor Williams.
Note that Lieutenant Governor Rockefeller's copies of the U.S. Constitution would fit in one's pocket. No such thing as a pocket edition of the Arkansas Constitution. You need a backpack. Carry it around. Anyway, the Constitution, whose sesquicentennial are we celebrating or commemorating? Whatever we're doing, was drafted with one overriding purpose, and that was that nothing like Reconstruction would ever happen again to Arkansas. And we tend to think of Reconstruction as a period, dated either 1863 or 1865 to 1877. But Reconstruction is also a process by which the United States answered the questions raised by emancipation and raised by the failure of secession. And those are fundamental questions of citizenship, of authority, and of labor. Now let's think about the questions raised by secession's failure. At what point and on what terms could a formally Confederate state be allowed to govern itself? Who could be trusted to wield authority in these circumstances? All those people who had made war on the United States government. What becomes of them? Well, the most obvious answer that history offers is not that rebels' rights would be fully restored. How has the victorious side typically answered these questions in the aftermath of civil wars and revolutions in France, in Russia, in Vietnam, in China. The losers' rights are immediately restored. Mass arrests, executions, exiles, re-education. No fun for the losing side. And let's think about the questions raised by emancipation, about citizenship. Should full citizenship rights be extended to people who had so recently been property? And the answer wasn't as obvious to many people in the 1860s as it might be to us. Of course, they should be citizens. And those answers were obvious to the people who had been enslaved. Of course, we should be citizens. But for many other people, hardly as obvious. Most nations that abolished forced labor during the 19th century had not immediately made those freed workers the legal and political equals of their former masters. And it was certainly not difficult for Americans in the 1860s to imagine an intermediate status between slavery and full citizenship. How far did they have to look to see people who were free but not fully invested with the rights of citizens? How far did they have to look? They just had to look across the dinner table. Or if there were women, they had to look no farther than the nearest mirror to see people who were free but not invested with full political and civil rights. So many white people had no problem imagining this twilight status for the formerly enslaved, a freedom far short of citizenship. And then there were the momentous questions emancipation raised about land and labor. Slavery, no peculiar institution in just some corner of the country. Cotton had been by far the nation's greatest import, and most of it had been grown by enslaved labor. On what terms then would freed people work? And who would control the land they worked? Would the South remain a place where black worked for white only now for a wage? Well, freed people had an answer to that: no. As South Carolinians said freed people said in a petition, we have made these lands what they are. They argued we should be granted those lands, granted title to those lands as compensation for generations of unrequited toil. But even many of the white people most sympathetic to the situation of the formerly enslaved couldn't accept the prospect of government mass redistributing land from the hands of slaveholders to the former slaves. That wasn't something they thought government should or could do, even though few of them seem to have any qualms about the mass redistribution of indigenous people's lands to white settlers. Somehow this was different. And for their part, former slaveholders preferred a labor system that would resemble slavery just as far as the 13th Amendment would allow. The workers bound to the land, at least through the harvest year. Well, the whole nation had to struggle with these questions of citizenship, authority, who could be trusted to govern, and labor. But Arkansas had to get an early start on addressing these questions. Within a year of fighting started, Union troops occupied Helena, at the very heart of Arkansas slavery. Phillips County enslaved more people than any other county in the state, and the Union Army is there in the summer of 1862, and their presence is thousands of enslaved people are taking the occasion of that presence to liberate themselves. Slavery is disintegrating parts of the state. And while the Union Army cannot be said to have ever controlled the state at any point in the war, by the end of 1863, it had captured the capital city, other of the important towns in Arkansas, creating these plausible grounds for creating a loyal state government. Well, our subject today is constitutions, and the three constitutions the state ratifies within the space of 10 years, 1864, 1868, and 1874, are important ways Arkansas addressed these questions of Reconstruction. But they offered wildly different answers, at least to the questions of citizenship and authority. Tragically, the constitutions of 1864 and 1868 really failed to grapple with those questions of land and labor, leaving those answers to be worked out on the ground in the struggle between landowners, black labor, and the federal agents deployed by the freedmen's. And that answer was ultimately sharecropping. Black labor, white land. That answer becomes clear pretty quickly. Those answers, those questions of citizenship, authority, wildly different answers. Our Constitution of 1864 emerges out of Abraham Lincoln's earliest tentative answers to these questions of Reconstruction. He wanted loyal governments established in Confederate states just as soon as some kind of Union presence was established in those states, thinking this would sap the rebel war effort by giving Southerners an alternative to rally around. He was convinced that there was a silent, maybe not majority, but large minority of Unionists who, given the opportunity, to rally for these new governments. Lincoln would allow any succeeded state in which 10% of the number of citizens who had voted in 1860, once they took a loyalty oath, they could set up a new loyal government. And that's an easy standard for Arkansas to meet. That would require only 5,000 people out of a total population of 435,000 in 1860 to establish a government. But Lincoln also insisted that these new governments officially abolish slavery, to put emancipation on a more solid legal ground. The Emancipation Proclamation had been a war measure of dubious constitutionality, but no one questioned the right of states to abolish slavery within their boundaries. So our 1864 Constitution does address that question of labor, but only to the extent of saying it would no longer exist in Arkansas in its bonded form. This Constitution officially abolishes slavery in Arkansas more than a year before the 13th Amendment does. But white Unionists were not ready to answer the consequent questions of citizenship raised by emancipation. What black Arkansans would be if they were not property. The Constitution of 1864 does not define the rights that the formerly enslaved enjoy, and certainly did not give them the vote. Essentially, punts on this question. But if Arkansas Unionists dodged this question of black citizenship, they had a firm answer for those questions of authority. Who would govern? Their legislature passes a law limiting the right to vote to men who supported this loyal government that had been established. Those who had stuck with the Confederacy afterwards would not be allowed to vote. No way would those who made war on the Union govern. No way. But Arkansas Supreme Court overturns these voting restrictions in late 1865, suggesting another answer to these questions of authority, essentially seeming to say former slaveholders and secessionists would enjoy the same rights and privileges that they had enjoyed in pre-war government and Confederate government. And in a remarkable development, President Andrew Johnson was content to allow the losers to answer the questions of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson, a states' rights unionist in the mold of Andrew Jackson, required only that Southern states acknowledge that slavery had been abolished and secession was dead. Beyond that, Johnson felt it was not his or the federal government's business who white Southerners elected to run state governments or what governments would do with respect to black people. Individual states would decide what rights African Americans enjoy. But with all this, elections in 1866 packed the Arkansas legislature with old rebels who behaved almost as if they had won the war. They denied African Americans the basics of citizenship, banning them from schools, juries, the ballot box. They elected former Confederates to represent Arkansas in the U.S. Congress. Old crowd back in power. Old rebels seemed equally unrepentant outside the legislature. Black people were frequently assaulted, even murdered, when they didn't behave as whites thought they should. Erstwhile rebels continued to settle wartime scores with their unionist neighbors. But what happened in Arkansas was happening all across the South. The legislature, stuffed with old Confederates, seemed intent on fixing something not so different from slavery, on black people, passing discriminatory laws that limited their rights, tried to tie them to plantation labor. Across the South, formerly enslaved white unionists killed by the hundreds, by their old masters, by their old foes. Well, think. You're a union veteran, or you are a surviving member of a soldier's family in the North. How do you like this set of answers? Old rebels exercising authority in the South. Black people denied citizenship. Many in the Northern public begin to wonder whether the hard-won Union victory will from. Think. Say, I'm served in the Army of the Potomac for 3 years. 2 of those years I had diarrhea. My brother, he came back in a box. My nephew came back without his legs or a right mind. who were supposed to have won this. There was Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Cold Harbor, oceans of blood, mountains of treasure we sacrificed to win this war. Where is our victory? If the people we defeated are governing the South and seeing things to do, please. Now, this outrage moves Republican representatives in Congress to radical new answers to the questions of citizenship and authority. If not land and labor, those questions of authority, we need a hard reset here. Congress passes the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to everyone born in the United States, guarantees them equal rights, bars insurrectionists from government wielding authority. And then the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 ordered the Army to suppress violence in the South. 4 states could govern themselves without military supervision, be readmitted to Congress. They had to write new constitutions that allowed black men to vote. Even as late as 1864, even sympathetic whites generally believed it would take some time before freed people would be ready to exercise full citizenship rights. But by 1867, many conceded that only by having black men vote could you secure a loyal government in the South, secure the fruits of Union victory. By themselves, white Southerners would elect old rebels. So the questions of emancipation had raised the questions of secession's failures, got radically new answers in 1867. Old rebels would be tossed out of power. The people who had once been their property would instead be their political and legal equals. So while Arkansas still had a constitution that was wet behind the ears, 1864, it needed a new constitution to enforce this new set of answers. In January 1868, a convention elected by both black and white voters meets here. It's dominated by the Republican Party, a northern anti-slavery party newly arrived in Arkansas. By far the largest part of this new party's constituency was Arkansas's new core of African-American citizens, rewarded Republicans for their embrace of emancipation and of civil equality. Smaller number of white Republicans, the so-called carpetbaggers, northerners who had moved south during or after the war, so-called scalawags, whites who had been born in the South or at least got here before the war. And most of the latter were, in Arkansas, were hill folk who had remained loyal to the Union and had suffered for it. And these scalawags really see their salvation less in black citizenship than in keeping authority out of the hands of those rebels they had fought so bitterly during the war. So the Constitution of 1868 is sterner in answering those questions of authority, even than the Unionist of 1864. It allows black men to vote, but also went farther than most states in preventing old Confederates from voting. Those who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, such as to hold office, wield authority, but had then supported the Confederacy, they're disfranchised. Those people known to have engaged in guerrilla warfare, disfranchised. Many other whites who could technically have qualified, refused to swear a required oath that they accepted black equality. A majority of Arkansans were white, Democrat, likely hostile to this new regime. But so many of them had supported the Confederacy, and so few of them accepted black equality, that the levers of authority were beyond their reach. But reconstituting citizenship went beyond allowing black men to vote. They could also wield authority more directly. State Superintendent of Education, the Commissioner of Immigration and State Lands, both African American. African Americans serve in the legislature in important local offices. 1869, half of Little Rock's city councilmen and its police chief were African American. Pico County has a black sheriff. These black office holders could meaningfully affect how law was enforced and justice was administered in their communities. But the Constitution of 1868 creates other mechanisms to enforce the authority of the new regime amidst this disaffected white majority. It creates a top-heavy state government, centralizing power in the governor and the legislature, rather than in county and local governments, as had been and would be the tradition. Arkansas had a smaller black population than many reconstructed states, and that black population is concentrated in Arkansas's eastern and southern fringes. If authority had been left in counties' hands, very many of those counties with large white majorities would surely have answered the questions of Reconstruction very differently than Republicans desired or Congress demanded. A strong hand in Little Rock also seemed required to serve the Republican ambition to create a new South that made things and sold things and not just grew things. And a strong hand also needed to bring an end to the political and racial violence that continued to plague the state. Well, Powell Clayton, the man elected to lead Arkansas under this Constitution, ruled Arkansas with an iron fist. But only one of them. He blew off his left hand in a hunting accident shortly after becoming governor. Clayton was a carpetbagger. He fought in Arkansas during the war, stayed to plant cotton near Pine Bluff. But with the powers of appointment that the Constitution placed in the governor's hands, or hand in this case, Clayton filled public offices with people more likely to be friendly to the new order than locally selected officials would have. In late 1868, Clayton declares martial law in 11 counties where Ku Klux Klan violence was particularly pronounced. He sent in militia forces, imposed on black men and hill country unionists to do battle with the Klan. The militia's stern counterterrorism tactics, which included hostage-taking, did reduce political and racial violence. But the fact that Clayton used martial law and military force led many to charge that his war on terror violated civil liberties. That, combined with the fact that many ex-Confederates weren't permitted to vote, allowed Democrats to portray Reconstruction as a minority imposing its will on a majority. Overlooking, perhaps, that a vital function of constitutional government is to protect the rights of a minority from a majority that would oppress them. Still, Republicans knew they needed more than this enhanced authority to secure the survival of their new order. African Americans were likely to remain only a minority of the voting age population. And Republicans knew they couldn't keep all of those ex-Confederates from voting forever. There was a national trend. Most other states were restoring old Confederates' voting rights by that time. So Republicans hoped programs to promote economic growth would broaden their appeal, bring them a majority. Business and manufacture, rather than just farming, would create a prosperity that would benefit all, white as well as black. Everyone agreed that the key to economic growth was building railroads. Reconstruction Republicans provide select companies $10,000 to $5,000, $15,000 in state bonds for every mile of railroad they built. And it worked. There are only a few dozen miles of track in Arkansas when Reconstruction begins. By the time it ends, Little Rock had been connected to St. Louis, to Chicago, to New York, to the Gulf Coast, to Memphis. But the most important of these Reconstruction programs to help whites as well as blacks was public education. Republicans supported schools because black voters demanded them, but also because they saw education like railroads as means of making Arkansas more modern and more prosperous. Arkansas hadn't accomplished much in terms of education before the Civil War. Money raised by land sales was made available to communities that might, or in many cases might not, establish schools. But in 1868, the legislature founded the state's first public school system, run by a state superintendent and 10 regional superintendents. For the first time, the state uses tax money to establish free schools in most communities. Republicans thus, under this Constitution, make schools and railroads appear out of nowhere. But Reconstruction irony is that its greatest achievements undermine Republicans' prospects all the more. Building a school system, subsidizing railroads, cost lots of money. State and local taxes skyrocket. And since enslaved property can no longer be taxed as it was before, much of this increased tax burden falls on small farmers' land. And Arkansans don't have a lot of money to pay taxes. War had devastated the state. There were bad harvests after the war. Cotton prices begin to fall. The state debt balloons with the millions of dollars in bonds donated to the railroads. Well, together with soaring taxes and deficits, there was corruption. Railroad companies bribe officials to secure state aid, bring politicians on board to enjoy the bounty. More generally, a state that is spending a lot more creates plenty of opportunities for politicians to steal some. Now, corruption was nothing new in Arkansas. You've got the real estate bank documents there on your table. Arkansas Democrats probably exaggerate the extent of corruption. Republicans' shady reputation was not entirely undeserved. So many of the white Arkansans to whom Republicans hope to appeal just find another reason to hate Reconstruction. Reconstruction was taking money out of their pockets through taxation, while corrupt politicians seemed to be growing fat at the public's expense. And Reconstruction's achievements also a reason for their downfall. Republicans make matters worse by fighting amongst themselves. More moderate Republicans join Democrats in criticizing Governor Clayton and his allies. High taxes, growing debt, corruption, martial law. denying many old Confederates the right to vote. Scalawags are unhappy that carpetbaggers held many of the most powerful offices. And this infighting comes to a confused climax in the gubernatorial election of 1872, which pits two Republicans against each other, as our symposium in the spring showed, ends with both of them claiming to be governor, their partisans shooting and killing one another, and finally federal acknowledgement that a man now thoroughly in cahoots with Democrats was the governor of Arkansas. Well, Democrats had their brief prepared against the Reconstruction Constitution. Centralized authority, violating the American tradition of local self-government, they said. It allowed taxes to rise in a state almost allergic to taxation. And it enforced black citizenship among a majority that held fast to white supremacy. Well, now, after 7 years in the wilderness, Democrats would offer their own answers to the questions of Reconstruction. Dr. Harris batters up.
Our second presenter this morning is Dr. Rodney Harris. Dr. Harris took his bachelor's from Arkansas State University, his master's from the University of Central Arkansas, and his PhD from the University of Arkansas. He was going in the right direction, heading west, in other words. He's author of 2 books, including a lovely one on a fraudster and murderer of Northwest Arkansas, a presentation on which I just heard him give, and he tells a good story, I guarantee you. He is also known as the volunteer director of the Randolph County Museum. In 2021, he received the Five Rivers Preservation Corporation's Ransom Bettis Award for his service in creating that museum, organizing it, making it an interpretive gem of Northeast Arkansas. I put the bite on him for this because his dissertation has to do with the Constitutional Convention of 1874. And so if we say that such things are sausage-making opportunities, this is the man who understands how the kielbasa came to be. Dr. Rodney Harris.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here. It's always a little daunting to follow Patrick. He is my dissertation advisor. So, as he says, we had years of working together to get to this point. He put up with me for 6 long years, in fact. So, when I began this project, I really didn't know what I was getting into in multiple ways, but it's kind of interesting. Every couple of weeks now, I get a phone call from either an attorney or from an issue group, I like to call them. Most recently, it was someone in Washington, D.C. who, can you send me all of your research on the 1874 Constitution? I'm like, no, I really can't. So anyway, it makes for interesting conversations. So, all right. So I look at the 1874 Constitution a little differently in some ways and challenge a couple of things. I hope I do that successfully. So Reconstruction and redemption, or the process of ending Reconstruction, is often treated as an afterthought. And the history of the Redeemer Constitutions is certainly an afterthought, it seems to me. So when I began my doctoral studies, I discovered just how little had been written about the 1874 document. And what amazes me is now 102 amendments later and counting. How many do we have? 3 or 4? We're trying to fight to determine how many we can vote on this time. We still don't understand just a whole lot about that Constitution. The most common assumption, and it's not wrong, but it's more complicated, is that the 1874 Constitution was written as a purely reactionary action against the 1868 Constitution and what I like to call perceived and actual abuses of Reconstruction. One way I've seen it put is they were trying to get rid of this foreign Yankee ideology that had invaded our state. And there's truth to that. They wanted to get rid of the 1864 Constitution, but at the same time, they're partaking of national trends. So I want to stress that a few times throughout my presentation today. Constitution makers did not make my job easy. Unlike the 1868 Constitution, the journal was never printed. Republicans in 1868 loved a good printing contract. It was a great way to put money in their friends' pockets, and so they published the Constitution rather quickly. And I even bought one off of eBay and one off of Amazon in my process. There is no bound copy for 1874. It is a handwritten, poorly handwritten, I will add, document. And the University of Arkansas Library had a copy on microfilm. And so I spent the next 4 years trudging through that. My eyes are still not good over that. So anyway, it took a lot of work, is what I want to say. But it was interesting. The other problem I encountered is that they did not record a lot of votes. And they did not record what committees did. One of their favorite tactics when they wanted to address a sensitive or controversial topic to avoid public scrutiny was to declare themselves a committee of the whole to avoid records. I hesitate to say that today, fearing that our legislature might follow suit and avoid freedom of information. But the other problem is that newspapers of the day, while they covered it extensively, they did so with a highly partisan slant. So you had to be careful piecing it together. As I've said, the scholarship concerning the 1874 Constitution needed to be more robust at best and lacked historical depth. But that doesn't mean there wasn't things written about it. Political scientists Calvin Ledbetter Jr., Diane Blair, and Robert Meriwether, for example, contributed to this scholarship. Walter Nunn, a supporter of constitutional reform, who I believe we're going to hear more about later, also contributed. Kay Collette Goss, who is a good friend, also worked to expose us to more about the Constitution. Goss and Nunn and other scholars, though, have tended to see the delegates to the 1874 Constitution as a harmonious group or a homogeneous group with little conflict. And I have argued that nothing could be further from the truth. If that were true, Arkansas's Constitution would be a rarity in the Redeemer era. Historians have devoted less attention to the Constitution, though. They have seen the Democratic majority as like-minded, as I said, though. They have focused on it as a means to get rid of that previous document, and so I want to challenge all of that today. There were fractures that existed, in other words. A close reading of the Constitutional Journal calls this like-mindedness into question. And here, I'm going to call this group of delegates Democrat conservatives because the Arkansas Democratic Party is not going to fully reemerge till after this convention. So while Democrat conservatives significantly outnumbered Republicans, this fact did not mean that all members agreed regarding ideology. Within the dominant Democratic conservative caucus, divisions, often deep divisions, existed and had to be addressed. After all, the Democrat conservatives consisted of pre-war Whigs, more inclined to embrace a more expansive notion of government. Some delegates previously had been Unionists who had only reluctantly embraced secession, if they did so at all, while others had been strong supporters of secession. These delegates were not like-minded when it came to economic interests. Delegates came from Arkansas's distinct geographic and economic regions, and this provided them with competing ideas. Not only historians tend to see this Democrat conservative majority as like-minded, they've also tended to see the Constitution of 1874 as severely restrictive. In fact, the 1874 Arkansas Constitution is often called the, quote, "thou shalt not" document. This is often seen as simply a reaction to the dreaded centralization of state government at the hands of Republicans under the previous Constitution. Historians have frequently overlooked the fact that Democrat conservatives were partaking of regional and national trends in Constitution making. While Arkansas Democrats and those in the former Confederate states sought to ensure that nothing like Reconstruction happened again, historical interpretations of the 1874 Constitutional Convention failed to address those trends that shaped constitution making not just in the South, but across the nation. Trends that included moving away from a positive or active government, moving to reaffirm an elected judiciary, and retreating from universal suffrage when possible. Historical analysis of the 1874 Constitution has focused on race and political development in the South while ignoring broader national and economic political trends. This tendency has left redemption to be viewed as a political development set apart from national trends. In Arkansas, Redeemers altered the role of the chief executive by limiting the governor's appointment powers, by embracing a plural executive where all constitutional offices were elective. They sought to restrict the real and perceived abuses of the legislative branch by limiting the General Assembly's ability to raise revenue, and embraced retrenchment. Redeemers further sought to deny the power of the General Assembly by restricting the number of days the legislature could meet in session. I think we should be thankful for that. The delegates also embraced an elective judiciary, aiming to limit the appointment power. This conservative ideology is often viewed as the sole possession of Southern Democrats, fighting against an ideology of Reconstruction and Republicanism. This conservatism was part of a national movement, though, that embraced limited government, personal liberty, local government. Historian Morton Keller argues that Northern and Western conservatives sought to scale back the active government of Reconstruction Republicans everywhere, but they returned to the limited government with greater local control. Gene Baker, Robert Kelly, and Joel Silby make similar arguments. Here, it's important to note, though, that we must add in white supremacy to this argument. So as a result of this broader conservative ideology, Redeemer constitutions frequently share common language with Northern and Western states. And here what I'll stop and say is, what I did not know going in is not just Southern states are rewriting their constitutions after the war, everybody is rewriting their constitution after the war. This has been this national trauma, and so it's a great time to revisit those documents. While the 1874 Arkansas Constitution was without a doubt influenced by adverse reactions to the ideology found in the 1868, quote, black and tan Constitution, it's more than a simple reaction. Arkansas's 1874 Constitution contains examples of language found in the era's Northern, Southern, and Western constitutions. This shared language is found in charters from Texas and Alabama to Illinois, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Nebraska, and Colorado, to name a few. All right, so who wrote this Constitution? Who were the Constitution makers? Well, the body included two former governors, Henry M. Rector and Harris Flanagan. Now, I find that interesting because Flanagan defeats Rector when there's not even supposed to be an election. I always tell my students that Flanagan's not even in the state, and I'm not even sure he knew he was running for governor, but it proves it's really hard to beat a guy in uniform. So they're both there as delegates. 3 future governors are delegates: James P. Eagle, Simon P. Hughes, and William Fishback, who we're going to hear more about later. We have 2 future justices of the Supreme Court, Henry Bunn and John Aiken. Walter Nunn argues that the body was, quote, one of the most outstanding legislative bodies ever convened in Arkansas in terms of honesty, motivation, ability, and experience of its members. I'm not sure I agree, but they certainly thought that was the case. These Democrats, though many of them were not lifelong Democrats, were farmers, lawyers. Several delegates were former Confederate soldiers. As we've already heard, they got back their right to participate. A number of these men had also served in the legislature prior to this, while a small number claimed membership in the Masons and other secret societies, by far not a majority. Convention delegates possessed a broad range of political, government, and business experience. 91 delegates were sent to the convention right here in this building. Of these, 79 were Democrat conservatives. 32 of these possessed some degree of political experience. 10 of these men had previously served in the 1861 Secession Convention. Notably, though, none of these delegates had served in the 1864 Convention, and only 3 served in the 1868 Convention. These delegates differed also along the lines of occupation and state of birth. 34 delegates counted themselves as farmers. Of these, 10 claimed membership in the Grange. The convention contained 32 lawyers, 3 ministers, 7 doctors, and at least 2 merchants. But it's worth noting that the professions of delegates are not always easy to ascertain. Some delegates, many delegates in fact, could rightly claim more than one profession. You could be a lawyer and a farmer, and it depended on which one you really identified yourself as. When it comes to the Democrat Conservative Caucus, 11 were Arkansas natives, while 28 were natives of Tennessee, 7 were Virginia natives. Other delegates hailed from Kentucky, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and we had 1 from New Jersey and 1 from Pennsylvania. So I want you to see here that these are not native Arkansans, the majority. Doesn't mean they're not Arkansans. We don't address how long they've lived here, but they're not natives. So what did they do when they got here and began meeting upstairs? Well, delegates to the 1874 Constitutional Convention waged an early war on centralization. Morton Keller, the historian, argues that they had a commitment to local government. They charged the Republicans who wrote the 1868 Constitution with lodging, quote, too much power in the state, violating the principles of local self-government, and embracing hyper-centralization. And it proved to be an effective rallying cry. One letter writer to the Arkansas Gazette said, quote, we are liable to be too much governed. Arkansas Democrat conservatives worried about the expansive appointment powers in the 1868 Constitution. As Dr. Williams has pointed out, it allowed the governor to appoint his cronies. But people across the nation are worried about appointment power as well. They even point to the fact that Abraham Lincoln had appointed governors in Arkansas and elsewhere during the war. These governors had, quote, acted with great vigor, is the way one person put it. Reconstruction Constitution makers had also embraced additional offices, and Democrat conservatives thought these imposed on their local freedoms. Offices such as that superintendent of instruction or education, lieutenant governor, and others. Now, we could also admit that since the superintendent of public instruction was held by an African American, that probably didn't make them very happy either. The 1868 Reconstruction document also saw the creation of the Office of Attorney General, and these new offices and other constitutional offices were given a term of 4 years, and the governor was able to replace them if they vacated their offices. The Constitution makers in 1874 sought to reverse this trend and restrain the chief executive. Under the Reconstruction Constitution, the governor appointed a majority of the judicial offices of the state, including the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The governor also possessed the power to appoint county officials, such as the county tax assessor. During Reconstruction, this power had allowed Governor Powell Clayton to fill local offices with his supporters, even in regions of the state that lacked a Republican power base. Democrat conservatives had seen this as stripping them of even the slightest chance of obtaining power. In this sense, the 1868 Constitution provided the most active government in the state's history. It was undoubtedly the most centralized government. Democrat conservatives were not only concerned about the growth of gubernatorial and executive power, they also shared a concern over the expanding powers of the General Assembly. Under the legislative article of the 1868 Constitution, bills that raised revenue had to originate in the House of Representatives. While this document did not make significant changes in the formal powers and structure of the legislature, it did change many things. The Republican-dominated General Assembly had, in the eyes of conservatives, exercised its authority too vigorously when it came to public schools, enacting railroad aid, and they said this led to corruption and overtaxation. Opposition to centralization became one of the central themes of the convention. Van Buren County delegates declared, "Let us blot forever from its history the name of centralization of power, and let us, if possible, have once again freedom, peace, and equal rights." Of course, we wonder who equal rights applies to. As part of this anti-centralization, the Arkansas Gazette called on delegates to strip the governor's power to declare martial law. After all, that had rankled many. Other proposals called for delegates to maintain the office of Secretary of State, Auditor, and Treasurer, and any future offices within the executive branch. The same elements called on delegates to make all county officials elected rather than appointed. They wanted local control, in other words. These calls made sense for Democrat conservatives who could count on winning large majorities in most, if not all, counties. These majorities would ensure victory, broaden their electoral power, and build a farm team for the future of the party. But not all Democrat conservatives agreed. Some within the factions questioned the wisdom of empowering the people with an unrestrained popular rule. As long as African Americans retained the right to vote, Democrat conservative majorities could not be assured of victory in the Delta, or even in Little Rock for that matter. This unrestrained popular rule could cause problems for conservatives down the road, especially where areas that contained large African American populations. Not all Democrat conservatives sought to weaken the chief executive. Future Governor Simon Hughes, maybe with his eye already on the governor's office, favored a robust chief executive office and wanted to endow the governor with a 4-year term, a strong veto, a line item veto, in fact. Hughes went as far as to suggest the governor be granted the power to convene the General Assembly and adjourn the Assembly when the two houses could not agree on adjournment. Ultimately, Democrat conservatives who supported a weaker chief executive won the day. Ultimately, the chief executive was given the power to adjourn the General Assembly when the two houses could not agree. But another issue arose, and that's residency. The draft would have required executive office holders to live in Little Rock. So to be governor, you would have had to live in Little Rock. It's not really that foreign a concept to us today. Most governors have no choice, unless they're Winthrop Rockefeller and can fly home every night. But some Democrat conservatives, led by White County's Jesse Newton Cypriot, feared such a requirement would lead to political power being centralized in the city of Little Rock and limit people from the rural portions of the state. John Eakin, the future Supreme Court Justice, said it was beneath the dignity of the state to tell a man where he should live, and ultimately this was rejected. Democrats addressed centralization in other ways as well. The Constitution of 1868 had provided for the office of State Land Commissioner, and Democrat conservatives are divided when it comes to this office in the future. They saw this office as problematic, and ultimately they're going to leave this alone and allow it to continue. John Miller, a delegate from my home county of Randolph County, put forward a motion saying that there shall be no additional state offices created by the General Assembly. And so that gives us a hint that they're really more concerned about expanding powers than about taking away things that are already there. Delegates took great pride in making sure governors would not get rich in the process. Delegates opted to enshrine the chief executive's salary within the Constitution. I would argue that's a habit we still have. See the 4 casinos and what county they go in and the ongoing battle over that. But they did this by placing the governor's salary right there in the Constitution. They would pay the governor the whopping sum of $4,000 a year. and they assured it would remain low because it would take a constitutional amendment to increase the governor's salary. This was an effective approach because in 1990, for example, Governor Bill Clinton earned the grand total of $35,000 as governor, making him the lowest paid governor in the nation. It would take a few more years to fix that. Other states partook in the trimming of the executive branch. For example, Florida maintained the governor's term at 4 years, but restricted them to 1 term. In Alabama, Redeemers reduced the term in office from 4 years to 2 years. And in Georgia, Constitution makers reduced the term and limited the governor to 2 consecutive terms in office. The trimming of executive power was not limited to the South, though. In 1875, Nebraska reduced executive terms from 4 years to 2. Constitution makers in Colorado set limits of 2 consecutive terms for the executive branch, as did other states. While much of the impulse to limit centralization appears to have been focused on the executive branch, concerns remained about the legislative branch as well. Some delegates worried that the power of influence in the legislative branch had grown to become far too active. One area of concern was special legislation, local bills, things that impacted one town, one county, one individual, or one company. These concerns went well beyond the South. On June 24th, a letter was published in the Arkansas Gazette urging Constitution makers to look at the new Constitution of Pennsylvania, not exactly what you would expect a bunch of Southern conservatives to say. One area of concern there was the incorporation of private companies. But what we see is voters, citizens, are well attuned to what's taking place across the nation as far as constitutions go. Constitution makers also sought to address the problem of office swapping. And one of the things here is that since Governor Powell had the power to replace officers, he would encourage them to resign and take another position so he could put a crony in their place, make sure that everybody lined up behind him. So Democrat conservatives barred this practice. They limited the ability of elected officials to being appointed to any civil office at the state level during the term of their office. Lastly, delegates addressed how often the Legislative Assembly could meet and for how long. Most delegates favored a biennial session, though some argued they should meet every 4 years. Those delegates wished to further restrict the legislative branch appeared to have been a slim minority, with many delegates fearing the body meeting once every 4 years would simply make the governor too powerful. When it came to the issue of legislative sessions, delegates sought to limit the biennial session to just 60 days. The provision was also found, by the way, in the West Virginia and Pennsylvania Constitution. They were both drafted before the Arkansas Constitution. Both states limited their session to 60 days. Later, both Alabama and Florida would implement the same 60-day limit as well. Jess Ross, a delegate from Clark County, wished to go even further. He sought to penalize legislators if they exceeded the 60-day limit. In other words, start charging them for being there. Not a horrible idea. I grew up always hearing the old joke that no one's life, liberty, or property is safe. The legislature's in session. So, not sure about that. Taxation would emerge as a central flashpoint in the 1874 convention. It would also be another issue where Democrat conservatives were divided and lacked uniformity. The rhetoric against unjust taxation had proven helpful to Redeemers. It had proven helpful in ending Reconstruction. But when they set about making a constitution, it actually becomes troublesome. This rhetoric was a double-edged sword, in other words. Once Democrat conservatives controlled all branches of government, as they knew they would, any effort to limit the power to tax would tie the state's hands. It would have hurt economic development. It would hurt paying off the state's debt. We're still going to hear more about it in a minute. On Monday, August 10th, the Committee on Taxation and Finance proposed language that would limit the General Assembly's ability to levy taxes. In particular, they sought to set a maximum tax that could be enacted. Again, they want to embed that in the Constitution. where what? A constitutional amendment would be required to change that. Not everyone agreed. Delegates with prior legislative experience thought that this was a bad idea. On the other hand, anything that's going to tie the hands, if you have legislative experience, becomes suspect. If you don't have legislative experience, it sounds like a wonderful way to limit this power. While many of these arguments were driven by real and perceived abuses by Reconstruction Republicans, Arkansas Constitution makers are once again partaking of national trends here when it comes to limiting taxation. People across the nation are tired of spending all this money to keep the South Republican and to keep the South occupied. There's also been an economic crisis take place here in 1873. At the end of the day, the final version of the article stipulated that the General Assembly could not levy a tax more significant than 1%, fully embracing retrenchment, and that would eventually help lead to a crisis and repudiation of the state's debt, as it did in other states. Let's look at the judiciary very quickly. Democrat conservatives were divided when it came to the judiciary. Some delegates sought changes because the district and lower courts exercised, quote, enormous power under the 1868 Constitution. One of the changes that was sought was how judges would be chosen. One faction of the Democrat conservatives supported the appointment of all judges, while the other supported the election of all judicial officials. This division was rooted in unhappiness with Reconstruction judicial actions, let's put it that way. Radical politicians had played a significant role in determining which faction delegates embraced. Delegates from districts or regions that could rest assured to elect Democratic conservative white judges favored election. Delegates hailing from counties with African American majorities, counties and regions that were at least competitive, supported the appointment of judicial officers. Despite these misgivings and considerable pressure from the Democrat-leaning press, the convention embraced an elected judiciary, which we still embrace today. Democrat conservatives, though, immediately began to address those concerns in another way. They would simply gerrymander the judicial districts so that they would have white majority. When it came to the state Supreme Court, the convention reduced the number of justices from 5 to just 3 and made the Chief Justice elected also. The 1874 Constitution also created the powerful county judge position that we still maintain today that confuses people from across the nation. In the end, the 1874 Arkansas Constitution was restrictive, though there are multiple instances where it could have been more restrictive. Constitution makers with prior governmental experience rebuffed the forces that would have made the document almost unworkable. This Constitution is also a product of its time and place. It's fair to say that the Democrat conservative Constitution makers were responding to the perceived abuses and the real abuses of Reconstruction Constitution makers and office holders. There was corruption. There was high taxes. However, saying that's the only contributing factor would be improper. Constitution makers in Arkansas and the rest of the nation were partaking of national trends. The period following the Civil War, leading to the 20th century, was ripe for change, and multiple states wrote new constitutions. Constitution makers in the North, South, and West embraced language and retrenchment in these similar language and retrenchment in these new documents. But what makes Arkansas different? And here's what I mean. Most of those states, if not all, most, I guess is the best way to say that, have written new constitutions, some of them multiple times since then. See Louisiana. Arkansas has repeatedly refused to ratify a new constitution, which means that our Constitution is constantly being amended, and we're constantly fighting over the process to amend it. And these amendments make the document incredibly difficult to navigate. even for the sharpest of legal minds. I teach at a Baptist school, and I'm fond of saying you put 5 Baptist ministers in a room and you'll get 10 opinions. You put 5 lawyers in a room, you'll get about 15 opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. We have time now for a few questions, then we'll take a brief break. Any questions from the audience for either of our esteemed presenters this morning? Ma'am. Good question. I started looking. Have you found it? Okay. I will repeat it for the benefit of the camera. The question is, Professor Harris used the microfilm copy of the Journal of the 74 Constitution. The microfilm was made by the Library of Congress. Where is the original? And the answer is, we don't know, because I haven't found it yet. I started looking in our records a couple of weeks ago, and then something about my job, I keep getting distracted by other things. But I am looking for it because that's definitely something that deserves examining and possibly transcribing so some of us can make sense of it without having to buy new sets of reading glasses. Since no one is brave enough to introduce me, I will simply lurch forward without further ceremony. My topic is not so much dealing with the Constitution, but rather with the First Amendment to it. Arkansas and its Constitution, how many have we had in the 150 years? 102 successfully adopted amendments, some negating previous amendments, so they're not all in effect. By comparison, Alabama has had 11 amendments since they adopted their constitution their latest constitution in 2022. Louisiana adopted their latest constitution in 1974. They've amended their constitution 216 times since then. Kansas, they are still working on the same constitution they adopted in 1856, and they've only amended it 95 times. What's the matter with Kansas? And our friends in the Lone Star State, since 1876, they have amended their constitution 528 times. Everything is bigger in Texas. It took a full decade for Arkansas to get around to amending its constitution for the first time in 1884. Amendment number 1 of 1884 states, "The General Assembly shall have no power to levy any tax or make any appropriations to pay either the principal or the interest or any part thereof of any of the following bonds of the state or the claims or pretended claims upon which they may be based, to wit, bonds issued under an act of the General Assembly of the State of Arkansas, entitled an act to provide for funding of the public debt of the state, approved April 6th, AD 1869, and numbered from 491 to 1860, inclusive being the funding bonds delivered to E.W. Caper, sometimes called the Holford bonds." With me so far? Or bonds known as railroad aid bonds, after which there's a paragraph, or bonds called levy bonds, being bonds issued under an act of the General Assembly of the State of Arkansas, blah, 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 or any law providing for any such tax or appropriation shall be null and void. On the face of the language, this sounds pretty dire. Enshrining in the state constitution, right up there, the prime position in the amendments list, a prohibition against paying our debts. That is, welshing on the state's bonded obligations. And by that, I mean no insult to the folks on the left side of Great Britain. This should be an act that responds to any of us who's ever been left holding an unpaid bill, a rubber check, or a dud promissory note. We should take umbrage at this idea, but it was an idea born of necessity, or at least the perception of it, which is mainly the same thing, I think. And it was the idea of its time. It was part of the zeitgeist. of the 1870s and 1880s, promoted in Arkansas by a man of some principle, and thereby hangs a tale. To begin with, let's talk about debt. In the years following the Civil War, Arkansas's Republican administrations, the Reconstruction administrations, particularly that led by Governor Powell Clayton, faced the intertwined problems of developing the state while restoring the credit of the state. What Hendrix College's George Thompson referred to as the broken dreams of antebellum days had left the state with a whacking public debt, mainly left over from pre-war days, of some $3.4 million. In other words, the price of a good-sized house in the Heights these days. The fact that the state had, you might say, hired the money, thank you, Calvin Coolidge, did not necessarily convince many politicians or the public that, in fact, the state owed its creditors the full repayment, because much of the debt was considered to be unjust debt. That is, illegitimate debt owed to usurious lenders or improperly incurred in the first place, therefore null and void. Politicians from the time of Arkansas's Governor Archibald Yell forward had debated how much of this state debt was just and how much of it was unjust. And on this hangs, as I say, a tale, particularly of that portion of the debt known as the Holford bonds. The so-called Holford bonds represented just a part of the state's debt in post-war years. They represented a debt run-up while trying to satisfy the obligations of the Arkansas Real Estate Bank. And here goes one of the parts where teachers of Arkansas history generally hope they can simply run from the room and no one will notice until the story is done. What was the Real Estate Bank? It's beyond the time we have available today or even this year to fully explain it. We should remember that the first Arkansas legislature meeting in this unfinished building in September of 1836 authorized the creation of banks as authorized in the state constitution. The first act passed by our new legislature was one incorporating the Real Estate Bank of Arkansas. The enabling legislation required the bank to issue some $2 million of bonds at 5% annual interest with a maturity in 25 years. The state government appointed a quarter of the bank's board of directors, but took no active official part in the management of this new financial organization. The bank was required to send reports periodically to the state legislature. How we doing? Just fine. No liquidity problem here. And the bank could borrow on the state's credit. The bank was intended to promote primarily the interests of planters, an intention that was stated in the enabling legislation. This meant that the main support came from the south and east of the state, the area wherein plantations were found. The interests of the northern portion of the state were somewhat appeased by the establishment of another state bank to have branches in Fayetteville and Batesville. Now, what was the real estate bank supposed to do? They were supposed to do what banks always do: provide a safe place to deposit money, presuming that you actually make it, issue letters of credit, perhaps extend credit to planters who needed a bit to tide them over during the thin seasons until the next planting and so forth. And they were also authorized to issue circulating notes, that is, paper money in denominations of not less than $5. You will find on your table replicas of $5 state real estate bank note. There for your delectation, do not try to negotiate these at your local Quick Mart. The scarcity of small money made change, or money of smaller denominations, very scarce, resulting in what was called change tickets, that is, legislature-designated small bills, notes commonly referred to shin plasters, fractions of these $5 notes, kind of like splitting up your quarter into various bits, except you didn't have hard money. You had these fractional paper notes, which could be redeemable only when collected together in sums of $5 and more. So the idea was you'd get a few of these shin plasters, get $5 worth. You could take them down to your local branch of the state real estate bank and redeem them for what knows, a $5 note, or technically you could demand specie, that is hard money. Ask for some silver or some gold. Now, the real estate bank was formed in the early days of statehood, and it was run by I hate to say this, enthusiastic amateurs. Were there professional bankers then? Not that many in Arkansas. The idea was to have a banking institution that would issue currency, be a reliable clearinghouse funded by the state through the sale of bonds. But the real estate bank massively oversold bonds in order to raise working capital so they could actually have some of that specie to hand out to those planters. And they became overextended. They had to suspend specie payments in 1839. And in January of 1840, the real estate bank's directors decided that they could not pay the debt that was coming due on these bonds unless some special means of funding were devised. The directors of the bank were going to be embarrassed. They might have to find receivers. So they resorted to a tactic to get around the bank charter's specific restriction against selling any of the state's bonds below par, that is, at a discount. In January of 1840, an agent of the real estate bank secretly offered 500 bonds, each with a face value of $1,000. That is $500,000 worth of bonds. And you have a copy, by the way, of a blank bond there. Go in and fill the amount you want and see if you can collect on it 10 years or so. These bonds were still in the real estate bank's possession. They were offered to the New York Trust and Banking Company as collateral for a $250,000 loan, which would tide the real estate bank over, get it past its liquidity problem. Well, the loan was not entirely delivered. The New York bank only delivered $121,000 and some change to the real estate bank, but still, the real estate bank was happy to get this money to satisfy people who were demanding something hard in the hand back home in Arkansas. Now, these bonds were transferred as collateral. It's kind of like going to the pawn shop. You give them your prized Les Paul Gibson, they'll give you $100, and they promise not to sell it until you've had a chance to repay your loan. Well, turns out that the folks in New York had just as many problems and were just as itchy to make some money ready as the real estate bank were. At the end of 1840, the New York bank transferred these Arkansas bonds to a third party. They sold the collateral that they had promised to not sell to one James Holford, a London wine merchant turned merchant banker, in exchange for $325,000. Selling these below par, but they weren't supposed to sell them in the first place. Oh well, promises of bankers. Soon after this transfer, the New York bank declared itself insolvent. So where did the money go? We're not going into that here. That's a different year. After word reached London, none other than James Holford himself made a quick trip to New York. While he was there, he addressed a letter to Governor Archibald Yell of Arkansas, asking how he might proceed to recover the money that he advanced on these bonds. Obviously, he was looking to the state of Arkansas for repayment. Governor Yell replied that the charter of the real estate bank had authorized it to sell its bonds at not less than par. Therefore, the sale of these bonds at a discount, and these bonds which had not been for sale in the first place, of course, had been illegal. The later transfer had been illegal, and thus the state of Arkansas was relieved of any obligation to redeem them. Repudiation in its early days. This did not stop James Holford from seeking repayment. The state of Arkansas would continue to avoid doing so. Holford himself visited Little Rock in 1850 and met with then Governor John Selden Roane. Apparently he was very well received, and his visit to Arkansas may have convinced him it would not profit him to press too hard for payment since the state was dead cash poor. The question of the bond's validity aside, the Holford Bank might be due some portion of the face value, but it was unlikely to get anything out of a state that was having a hard time paying its bills even then. What complicated things even further was that the real estate bank went into receivership in 1855, the year after James Holford had died, leaving 11 heirs. The 11 heirs went after the state of Arkansas. They sued in Pulaski County Court. The suit was dismissed on a technicality. The original bonds had not been presented for repayment, only copies of them. This violated a law that had been passed just after the Holford suit had been filed, requiring that the original bonds be presented in evidence. So the county claimed it had no jurisdiction. Case dismissed. Case is appealed to the Arkansas State Supreme Court, which also dodges the bullet. The case eventually goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, argued by none other than Albert Pike for the estate on a writ of error. The U.S. Supreme Court upholds the Arkansas Supreme Court and effectively upholds Archibald Yell's dodge from back in 1840. Chief Justice Roger, Mr. Dred Scott Tawney himself, writes the opinion which tells that a sovereign might not be sued in its own courts without its own consent and permission. It might withdraw its consent when the public interest demanded it. Very convenient. Tawney opined that the High Court had no jurisdiction to override the legislative decree of a state, could not force the state to redeem its bonds, and so the case went back to state court. It finally was argued one last time before the Arkansas Supreme Court, and they issue a ruling in 1862. They say that since the real estate bank had violated its charter by peddling those bonds below par, the act of hypothecation, that is, offering an asset as collateral for a loan, was illegal, so the state was not liable for them. They were orphan bonds. Pretty good for framing on the wall, but you can kiss it goodbye, folks, otherwise. But the court cautioned, since the real estate bank had in fact accepted $121,000, the money that had been advanced by the New York bank, it was bound in good conscience to repay that loan at some point with those bonds as collateral. Now, what did this yield? Absolutely nothing, because, of course, this is 1862. There are bigger things afoot. By this point, the real estate bank and its shadowy twin, the State Bank of Arkansas, had long since passed away into receivership. Well, let us skip over the war years to 1868, when, according to William Clarence Evans, the state's bonded debt totaled by this time over $3 million, which included the liabilities of the failed state banks, including those pesky Holford bonds, which would never go away. 1868 is also the year in which former Union General turned Phillips County planter Howell Clayton, a force to be reckoned with in the state's Republican Party, is elected governor of Arkansas. The leader of the so-called radical Reconstruction faction, Clayton is remembered today for his effective and forceful repression of night riding and as for attempts to manipulate Arkansas politics, even after he departed the office of governor for the palmy confines of Washington, D.C. as one of our U.S. senators. But we should remember that he was a developer as well. He backed the sale of state bonds to finance railroad construction, continuing a practice begun by his predecessor, Isaac Murphy. By 1874, under Governors Murphy, Clayton, interim Governor Hadley, and even, let's throw Baxter into the mix here. The state had authorized nearly $10 million worth of railroad bonds and issued $5.35 million worth, authorized by the Railroad Bond Act of July 21st, 1868. However, there was a bit of a snag. Article 10 of the Arkansas Constitution of 1868 stipulated that the credit of the state shall never be loaned for any purpose without the consent of the people thereof expressed at the ballot box. So the Railroad Act provided that the issue of these bonds be on the ballot in November of 1868. And the people of Arkansas voted for the sale of railroad bonds, basically a 5-to-1 margin. There was there was great support for actually getting railroads built in the state. And oddly enough, unlike was the case in many other parts of the country, these bonds actually seem to have resulted in the construction of railroads that would eventually earn money, although many of them went into receivership for a time or two themselves. Additionally, Clayton and his immediate successors issued by 1874 some $3 million worth of levee improvement bonds, authorized in an act of March 16, 1869, amended in 1871. For reasons too complex to deal with before lunch, these bonds failed to yield much in levee improvement but led to much financial chicanery. That'll be a book in itself. The bottom line is that by the 1870s, going into the 1870s, the state's debt rose steadily. Also add into this the state's issuance of scrip during this period to the tune of some $3 million worth, which added insult to injury in terms of a bonded indebtedness. $3 million on the face of it, much less in terms of actual value. Scrip trading at something between 18 and 25 cents on the dollar by 1874. Now, what is the state doing to actually pay on these obligations? In April of 1869, the legislature enacted the McCulloch Funding Bill, which provided for the sale of bonds to fund, that is, acknowledging our debt as semi-permanent and legitimate, acknowledging this obligation, the state's whole indebtedness, including the Holford bonds, using current income to pay the interest while occasionally paying on the principal. In this way, the debtor, by at least servicing the interest, if not the principal, would show good faith but not spend itself broke trying to satisfy its full obligations. In this way, Powell Clayton and his associates in the Arkansas legislature reasoned that the state could repair its already somewhat tarnished credit rating by paying off very, very slowly its honest debts. When Clayton approved the McCulloch measure to fund the state debt, it specifically included a provision for funding the Holford debts. And this occasioned a storm of protest, since many could remember the previous court rulings explicitly voiding these obligations. At first, Powell Clayton withheld the portion of the McCulloch bonds that were meant to fund the Holford debt until he could investigate the matter further. This raised cries of protest, just as the Act's funding of the Holford debts had done. Ultimately, though, Clayton decides to release these bonds, funding the Holford claim, which by this time had ballooned, thank goodness to the miracle of interest, to $1,370,000. My goodness, what interest had done. At this point, the story gets more complex, but let us cut to a date, a number, and a concept. The date, July 1st, 1874. A new constitution in the making and financial embarrassment in the air. An abstract of state indebtedness and interest on same as of that date reveals that the state was a whacking $16,166,973 in debt, plus change. There's the date, there's the number. What's the concept? It's the one that occurred to Archibald Yale back in 1840. Repudiation, basically saying, we don't own all of that. Let's take another look at that. Yes, we're talking the concept of repudiation. That is, rejecting the necessity of paying back debts which the state could not be held morally or possibly legally liable. Now, what made up the state's debt at this time? Let's first look at what the Solons of the state decided were the state's just debts. Okay, what do we have? State bank bonds, the ones that hadn't been sold to the Holford Bank, $744,000 plus chump change. Real estate bank bonds, $1,486,230. Various Arkansas funding bonds, that is paying back for that scrip they'd issued, $1,925,500. State deficit bonds, $65,000. 1874 war bonds. War bonds? Somebody had to pay for cleaning up the mess of the Brooks-Baxter War. That's another $200,000. And state scrip outstanding, $1,750,000. Total, $6,170,650. But what about the unjust debts? We have various railroad bonds in the total amount of $6,117,165. Levy bonds, $2,343,658.55. And those pesky Holford bonds, the interest had kept ticking on these. They were reckoned by this point at $1,534,400. Not bad for that initial purchase, right? Total of the unjust debt, $9,995,223.55. Annual interest to be funded on the entire of this debt, just and unjust alike, $848,000 and chump change. Property tax assessments for 1873 totaled $1,014,682. Okay. Paying over $848,000 of interest, you've got a total state assessment a little over $1 million, leaving theoretically a whopping $166,442 on which the ship of state might sail. Good times. Good times. By this time, though, what's current in legislative discussions in Arkansas and elsewhere is the concept of just versus unjust debt, essentially justifying either scaling down the debts which the honest conservative Democrats had inherited from their rascally tax and spend and build and enfranchise Republican predecessors, or at least simply to repudiate large portions of such debts outright, saying, wasn't our show, shouldn't have wrote those up, we don't have to pay them. Not surprisingly, in debt-ridden Arkansas of 1874, with a Constitution of brewing, there was some interest in such a simplifying approach. And one of the Constitutional Convention's delegates formed a nexus of such sentiments. This would be the Honorable William Meade Fishback of Sebastian County. Now, who was Fishback? The best summary of his life is found in Tom DeBlack's article in the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. Let me give you a few high points. He's a Virginia native, son of a prosperous farmer, graduated from the University of Virginia. He read law. He'd moved to Fort Smith in 1858. All right, Heather is telling me speed it up, and so I shall. He was a Union delegate to the Secession Convention. He voted first against secession, then with secession. A man of good movable principles, leaving poor Isaac Murphy in the lurch as the last Union man standing. But Fishback then headed north to Missouri as the war broke out, dabbled in Unionist Democratic politics up there, joined the Union Army, promised to raise a loyal Arkansas regiment, came down to Little Rock, ostensibly recruiting for this regiment, while in fact publishing a Unionist newspaper here in town, became part of the state's new Republican leadership in the years following the war, has been credited with authoring much of the Loyalist Constitution of 1864, and was even one of those sent to the United States Senate, although he was prevented from taking his place there. By the 1870s, William Fishback, the Unionist, the Democrat turned Republican, was disillusioned with Reconstruction, and so he drifted back into the Democratic camp. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1874, and there championed a provision that would invalidate certain categories of state debt, those which had been incurred illegally or which did not benefit the state. This attempt failed, but in the legislatures of 1877 and 1879, yes, he'd gotten himself into the House, he again called for such invalidation or rejection of these classes of debt, earning for himself the honorable title, the political moniker of the Great Repudiator. Perhaps Fishback was simply drinking deep of the zeitgeist. In June 1877, the Arkansas Supreme Court had effectively declared the issuance of those state railroad aid bonds from back in the 1860s and 70s unconstitutional. The grounds for this ruling had been skimpy, claiming that the November 1868 election, which had authorized the sale of these bonds, had been held before the end of the legislation. And the bond legislation had been passed without the emergency clause, so it was supposed to not go into effect until after the end of the session, and the session did not expire until April of 1869. So the act, which lacked the sort of emergency clause that is common today, could not have taken effect until July 10th, 1869, long after the session. So the election was nullified. And the bonds which had sold like barbecue on the 4th of July, therefore, because the sale had been illegal, this created no liability for the state. and were void. They were worthless. Chief Justice David Walker made it clear he was not repudiating debt. This is a nice one. It is no repudiation of a contract to deny its payment because there not being a contract, there can be no repudiation of it. Huh? It's worth pointing out that this bit of circular sophistry was widely applauded, at least in Arkansas. In the nation's financial centers, not so much. A few months beforehand, Governor William Miller had suggested a plan to settle the state's just debts. Basically, resume paying the interest, which might make it possible for the state to borrow money and begin some of the programs of development that the people had called for. This would, of course, require repayment, and in 1877, the legislature acted to reduce taxes, making the state's ability to plausibly pay what it owed even less than they had been before. In 1877, entrepreneur and Arkansas Gazette proprietor John D. Adams, who would in fact in 1878 be a participant in the last known duel to be fought on the streets of Little Rock, went on a mission to New York to meet with the state's creditors, seeking a renegotiation of the state's just debt. Adams was successful except in the case of those blasted Holford bonds. Ultimately, the deal fell through. Now, George Thompson's article in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly in 1970 noted that the theme of paying only the just debt of the state had also carried in it the latent threat of repudiation. If repudiation were ever combined with resentments felt towards the Reconstruction government, the political potential would be great. There was political hay to be made, and William Fishback was determined to be the haymaker. In the 1879 session of the legislature, Representative Fishback sponsored a resolution proposing an amendment to the Constitution prohibiting levying taxes or making appropriations to pay principal or interest on certain classes of the public debt, levy bonds, railroad aid bonds, and those Holford bonds. On April 2, the measure was approved by a joint session of the Ledge, just upstairs from us, and repudiation became one of the burning issues of the 1880 election season. Fishback, the champion of liberating Arkansas from the yoke of Republican-incurred debt peonage, may have been the man of the hour. He was opposed by some fiscally cautious, smooth operators, including Augustus Garland and Uriah Rose. Ultimately, the Fishback Amendment lost in the 1880 election, but only by 3,321 votes. This was an idea that would come back, as would the man himself. In 1883, Governor Thomas Churchill asked the legislature to create a committee to investigate the question of disputed versus undisputed, that is, unjust versus just state debt. The committee did its work and concluded that the undisputed or just portion of the state debt amounted to $4,054,020. The disputed debt, including inevitably those Holford bonds, came to somewhere over $10 million. Incoming Governor James Berry told the Solons that same year, "The fact that there are outstanding bonds that are believed by a large portion of our people to be fraudulent and void has proven to be a constant source of embarrassment and annoyance. The question of the state's liability must be finally determined by the people." Now, by this time, Wild Bill Fishback was out of the House of Representatives, but the text of his proposed amendment of 1880 had lingered. In 1883, the resolution he had sponsored back in 1879 was disinterred and improved by the Arkansas legislature to be resubmitted to the people, and on September 2nd, 1884, Arkansas voters approved the repudiation amendment, would become amendment number 1 to the 10-year-old state constitution, 119,000 to 15,000. And in so doing, cast their vote for the destruction of the state's already feeble fiscal reputation, joining a club which would ultimately include 8 southern states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. The effect on state credit, you can predict. Arkansas experienced difficulty in selling state securities well into the 20th century, with good reason. On the other hand, Fishback, well, that great repudiator moniker, it stuck with him. He ran for the House again in 1884. He won a last term. twice for governor in the 1880s and failed, but he was elected governor in 1892. He got just one term, one of those fine 2-year terms, campaigning on a platform of developing Arkansas through government, promoting good schools, agriculture, resource development, flood control, good roads, railroads, and spending money to promote Arkansas's image in the eyes of the nation. In other words, money you'd have to find somewhere. On that, the offense rests, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Gill, the eyes of history are upon us.
Not again.
Okay. We close today's session with a few words about attempts to bring a new constitution to the people of Arkansas. It's been a long time since I picked up that birthday cake, ladies and gentlemen. Starting to trip over my own shoelaces, so I'll beg your indulgence in advance. To talk with me about attempts to replace the Constitution of 1874, I've asked Mr. John Gill to join me at the front here. Mr. Gill took his bachelor's and his law degree from Vanderbilt University, joined the Arkansas Bar in 1962. He's past president of the Arkansas Bar Association. He's the author of books on Arkansas's historic courthouses, the Arkansas Governor's Mansion, and Depression-era post office art in Arkansas. He worked a project that was ultimately unsuccessful, was near and dear to my heart, to save the historic White River Bridge at Clarendon. Not all efforts succeed, but the efforts themselves are good ones. He was the 2020 winner of the Parker Westbrook Award, Preserve Arkansas, for his work in historic preservation and in drawing people's attention to the need to preserve our built heritage. He was a delegate to the 1969 Constitutional Convention. He was special counsel to Governor Tucker for the proposed Arkansas Constitution in 1996. He was the chair of the governor's task force for a new constitution in 1995. So it's my honor to share a table with a man who I have known and learned from for as long as I've been in Little Rock, Mr. John Gill. A very quick summary, I promise a quick one, of attempts to find something a little more modern to replace the Constitution of 1874. As early as the 1880s, there were at least 2 bills introduced to allow convention calls to be submitted to voters. Convention calls submitted to voters in 1888 failed by a wide margin. In 1917, in his inaugural address, Governor Charles Hillman Bruff calls for a convention stating that Arkansas firmly needs new governmental garments. No jokes about members and new clothes at this point. The legislature went along with the governor, and the convention meets on November 19th, 1917. They adjourn until July 1918. A draft document is submitted to the people for ratification. That December, voters reject it, 61% against. So that put the kibosh on constitutional regime change for a while. But in 1967, the Arkansas legislature authorized the creation of the Constitutional Revision Study Commission. The commission requested that the legislature and the governors authorize a ballot question regarding a convention in the general election of 1968, a convention to be held in the spring of 1969, and voting on the resulting constitution in 1969. In 1969, delegates met in January to organize. The convention's president was Dr. Robert Loeffler of the University of Arkansas Law School. He reminded delegates to be practical. Despite all the efforts, numerous endorsements of the document that finally resulted, voters defeated the proposed constitution in 1970 with over 57% of the vote. A few years later, Governor-elect David Pryor, one of the Young Turks who had been behind the motion for the movement to create a new constitution, now he's in the hot seat. He suggests the commission might draft a new constitution rather than have the expensive full convention, In 1975, the legislature authorized such a commission to propose a limited set of changes to the existing Constitution, but the act is challenged, ultimately declared unconstitutional. Oh well. But 1977, a special session of the legislature adopts a measure calling for a convention. In the 1978 general election, voters selected delegates, choose the general election of 1980 as the preferred ratification canvas. 1979, the state's 8th Constitutional Convention meets in May and June. They recess, they reconvene in June of 1980. Apparently, many, perhaps most voters are unaware of the existence and work of the commission. In November, the proposed new Constitution is rejected again by 62% of the voters. In 1995, Jim Guy Tucker suggests that Arkansas shouldn't begin a new century with a Reconstruction era Constitution. And the ledge responds with the hearings deliberating a constitutional convention, and it's complicated after that. I would like to yield the floor to a gentleman who was there to talk some about why is it so hard to get a new constitution in this state, sir? And what happened?
It's hard to get a new constitution because the people rule. I was a delegate in 1970. The 70 and 80 Constitution conventions were pretty similar. We were elected upon the basis of seats in the House of Representatives, which means there were 100 delegates. I was elected from Pulaski County, sat in generally where the Pulaski County delegation sat in the General Assembly, it turns out. It operated very much like the General Assembly operates today, with committees and that same kind of approach. The primary difference in the way it was set up in both is that there were the committees were divided by subject matter under the Constitution, legislative issues, judicial issues, etc. General Assembly, of course, just takes everything across the board and puts it together. That worked pretty well. The delegates were generally pretty genteel among the issues. There was an awful lot of understanding of the problem and an awful lot of commitment to trying to get something done about it. So I served as chairman of the Municipal Government Committee. We met separately. We addressed the constitutional issues relating to local government, one of which was, of course, cities weren't even mentioned on the basic framework, so pretty easy for us to go farther with that to kind of get a new look at what government was like, supposed to be like at least in the 20th century. As David said, those efforts did not prevail, and there's a lot of political discourse that you might read about why, what, and so forth, and I won't try to get into that. When Governor Tucker, as all governors have done, took an oath to support the Constitution, I sometimes wonder, and I knew Jim Guy pretty well, I sometimes wonder if he really had gotten into the depth of what he was getting into. He was dealing with what Dr. Williams talked about, Lieutenant Governor Rockefeller saying that the Constitution was a manual for government, which indeed it is, or at least it's supposed to be. And Jim Guy was given a manual for government that was written, basic part of it, written when there were no paved roads in Arkansas, and never would be until the next century. Now, when we talk about the Constitution, we technically are talking about the Constitution as amended. That's what we have today. It's the Constitution as amended. But I still go back to the 1874 document, which was, interestingly, adopted just 6 months after the governor of Arkansas was taken at gunpoint out of this building in what became a post-Civil War Civil War. In fact, if you walked in the main door of the building off of Markham Street, you literally today walk through a former war zone. And a lot of people just can't grasp that. The the environment in which all of this was done. There's been an awful lot of beautiful discussion this morning on the background, which is, I think, enormously helpful, that I've gained a lot of benefit from. But if you put it in the context that you're dealing today with a Constitution that was drafted just 6 months after Civil War took place on the very steps of this building, you kind of get a feel for what we've got to do, or what we were trying to do in all of these efforts in the Constitutional Convention and in Governor Tucker's attempt. By 1996, when the last effort was submitted to the voters, there were at that point just 73 amendments. Amendments that repealed prior amendments. It's still, how do you say this politely, a pretty cumbersome document to try to wade through. And if there's any doubt about why people don't know much about the Constitution, it's harder to read than Deuteronomy, and it's much more difficult to understand. And so it's really hard for people to get kind of interested in the Constitution when they're presented with this ball of wax to try to deal with. Well, Governor Tucker probably had enough. And he said, in a democracy, the people's work in government is performed by their elected representatives and their elected officials. As governor, I have sought to discharge my responsibility, and I think indeed he did. His approach was much different than the two conventions. He designated me to try to work out the framework for how this would come about. And in so doing, we put together a committee of 27 members with experience in dealing with the Constitution, both as lawyers and non-lawyers. Not everybody there was a lawyer. And the governor had put together this committee. The committee did their work in sort of unusual fashion. We met. My office was downtown in the Metro Center Mall, as it was in those days, and I love to tell the story about my office was just about the size of from these two windows back. And it was 2 stories, though, and Becky Peach came in to help me. My office was up on the upper level, and we arranged this elaborate means of communication. I got a basket with a rope, and we lowered it down, and I'd give Becky something that I wanted to get typed or looked at. She'd type it, put it back, and we'd wheel it back up to where I was sitting. Growing out of that process and growing out of the enormous work that a whole bunch, I was paid, but the basic part, because I was had the second role as special counsel, but the members of this committee were not paid. They were all volunteers. And there were people who stepped forward and said, I wanted to do something. There's some pretty interesting names in that committee. A fellow named Asa Hutchison was a member of that 27 group. Bob Leffler was still active, and he came back. Betty Dickey, who would later become Chief Justice, was in that group. And I could go on and spend a lot of time naming all these people like Mark Pryor and others who were in the committee. But they put their work together somewhat fashion like the Constitutional Conventions had done. There was a group that took care of municipal finance. Some of the best people in the business were in that group. There was a group that took care of judicial articles, et cetera, et cetera. It was all put together, laid out. I was in charge of trying to get all the papers in one same place and have them read like they've been written, not by a group, but by a single individual. And it was given to the governor, and the governor looked at it, and back and forth we made some changes. Then he, for the first time in Arkansas history, at least in modern Arkansas history, gave a democratically elected group of representatives of the people to prepare the Constitution. Our committee drafted it. We didn't prepare it. That was prepared technically by the Arkansas legislature. So Governor Tucker, as any governor does then and still does, presents his program, if it's a bill or whatever, he presented it to the legislature and said, look at this, and I ask you to adopt it. Well, the legislature did what the legislature's always done. It meddled and changed and whatnot. But the theory was, instead of a group of people that were not politicians, as in the first two conventions, not the first two I just talked about, 70, 80, instead of a group of people that are not politicians presenting to the people, maybe if the politicians who are representatives of each of the counties and the cities would do it, and if they presented it, then it would work. Well, the draft, as the governor said, is not intended to resolve the problems with and unreasonable restraints upon the efficient operation of state and local governments, but it is to try to bring it into some step of semblance to modern times. He said, but our present Constitution is filled with obstacles to prevent today's citizens from responding to the complex interaction of the modern federal, state, and local governments. And that is a mouthful, but it really says what the heart of the problem of the Constitution was then and is today. We do not operate in Arkansas in a vacuum. We operate as one of a member of states in a national system. And the national system is doing all kinds of things with all kinds of programs that affect your people, affect the operation of your hospitals, affect all the operation or the building of roads. And that is a conflict which rises constantly between what the federal government is trying to do and what the state governments do. And you've heard some discussions about that. But when it gets down to trying to put all that together, you're dealing with the Constitution, which is based upon one that was written before we didn't have paved roads. So it's impossible for me to hit all the high points, but I'm going to give you just a kind of a smattering of what the Constitution of 1996 dealt with. First of all, it established a lot of really important provisions with short-term debt of municipalities. At the time then and now, it's still difficult for municipalities to operate on short-term debt. Buying a fire truck is extraordinarily difficult, even today, in the government of Arkansas. And this was an attempt to try to address that and make it much more flexible. They considered a new concept which is beginning to take hold a little bit called tax increment financing, which was an idea to rebuild cities. And if you get a area that has a tax base, and let's say that tax base is providing $40,000 a year, and if a private individual will go in and develop that area, and the new development that comes from it will raise $100,000 in taxes, you can take that increment, that $60,000, and pledge it for debt or use it to build your city or rebuild your area. Very modern concept, one that should have been adopted, one that we are kind of dancing around today, but it was put in black and white in this 1996 document. It also authorized school buildings, and I love this one. Most people don't know that it's illegal to vote in a public school, because the Constitution of Arkansas says you can only use school dollars to pay for school education. And I've always wanted to have the lawsuit if somebody's in a close election to pop that on them and say your votes in Pulaski Heights Junior High School didn't count because the Constitution says you can't use the school for elections. In any event, what we tried to do was to address that, and we did in one of the provisions that said it could be used for other public purposes. The state boundaries, I've been interested in state boundaries a long time. In fact, I've got an article in the Arkansas, no, it's in the encyclopedia about Arkansas boundaries. But the state constitution, written when we didn't have public roads, defines the Arkansas boundaries by metes and bounds description. The only two you'd ever recognize is the southern border of Missouri and the northern border of Louisiana. Everything else is a metes and bounds, meaning so many 100 feet or miles up on this degree of the compass, and then you change the degree and you go this direction. In any event, that's the way it was set up in the Constitution, and that's the way it's still set up in the Constitution today. Well, we attempted to change that by simply saying those boundary descriptions are eliminated and we use what it has historically been. But, you know, every time the Mississippi River changes course, the state of Arkansas changes course. I saw something here recently that, and I don't have these numbers exactly right, but there are about 27 places in Arkansas today that are on the east side, the other side of the Mississippi River. And there are about the same number of places in Mississippi that are on the west side of the Mississippi River, and the same thing for Tennessee. Anyway, we tried to address that and did so, but it didn't, of course, go anywhere. The Code of Ethics was enshrined in the Constitution in this document. Everything except non-judicial offices were enshrined in what was supposed to be the new Constitution to set out a Code of Ethics. We eliminated the confusion about the county being only able to levy 1/2 of 1% in taxes. I mean, that's pretty generous in the old days, but it didn't work too well even then, and certainly not now. And we made an attempt to try to clarify that. We had a lot of cleanup things, and several of them were kind of fun. We changed men to people, you ladies will be happy to know. We eliminated the atheist disqualification from holding public office, which is still in our Constitution, the basic document at least. We changed the word houses in the Constitution to dwellings. This is all kind of mundane, funny stuff, it seems to me, but it gives you an idea of the detail that's really necessary to make this thing readable. You read something that talks about houses, do you really mean apartments? We had tried to clarify that in the 1996 edition. We changed the word, well, I'll mention that. We kept treason. Treason's in the original Constitution. It's still there. We couldn't figure out any reason to take it out. Nobody's used it since it was written. But we had treason. We tried to make this somewhat political. If you start taking out treason, they'll say, well, look what you're trying to do. So we tried to eliminate that art. The draft that was prepared under Governor Tucker's leadership authorizes the legislature to address constitutional provisions declared unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. Now, you've heard some pretty fine lawyers up here talking about some of the issues of interpretation. If you don't think that's tough to interpret, you get a provision in your Constitution that the United States Supreme Court has said is unconstitutional. How do you operate your state government in that fashion? It's still a mystery, but we did make an attempt to address that particular issue. There was an attempt made to eliminate the duplicity of state income taxes returns. As you all know, they can't be the same. They have to be different because the Arkansas Constitution today will not let you mimic the federal Constitution for your income tax returns. And that was an attempt to try to clarify. I mention these things just to let you know it's still there after all the effort of 2 constitutional conventions and what Governor Tucker and the legislature at that time attempted to do. One of the things that we did that the constitutional conventions had done too is the schedule. And I always found that fascinating. The schedule is not a constitutional provision, but it's the way you implement the Constitution once the Constitution is amended. And that in itself is a whole bag of worms that has to be worked out through the schedule. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it back to you so we can talk about anything that I did not talk about. I did not want to belabor this too long, but when you start talking about constitutional revision, we could talk till happy hour, and I'm again that.
Okay. Well, my voice of conscience has held up a hand suggesting we had 5 minutes. We have less than an hour going through this. She has a long-suffering conscience. But with all of these updates, all of these adjustments, all these modernizations, elimination of and so forth, what happened?
Well, it's hard to put something like this for anybody to understand. And you're trying to get 2 million people to understand what I just went through in 5 minutes, except to really understand it. And we pass out the Constitution. We did then. We passed out this document, passed out the working document. It's about that thick. And you're going to ask people that are working 9 to 5 and 2 jobs on the side and trying to raise 3 kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to sit down and try to understand that. It's just awful difficult to do. And that was Governor Tucker's thought, that if the legislature says this is okay, people will follow the legislature. Well, that was an idea that didn't.
But my notes suggest the legislature, they opted to have actually call a convention. Delegates to actually ratify.
No, that, and what?
Have I misread?
No, in the 96 effort, Governor Tucker submitted to them a proposed constitution that our committee had put together. And he said, legislature, here's your proposed constitution that I'm proposing to give to the people. I ask you to look at it and make changes you think are necessary, and then you submit it to the people. Okay. So this was the first time in history that the legislature had submitted the Constitution to the people, vis-a-vis the other 2 attempts where a committee of the convention
and didn't go any further.
No, I haven't compared the results of those elections, David. That's a pretty good chore. I mean, a pretty good. Not sure, it'd be a pretty good thing to do, to see how close it came. My recollection is it came closer than any other effort, but that's really 50 years ago trying to remember, and I don't remember what I had for breakfast sometimes. So sure, that's right.
But I was looking, and I was down at the state library the other day, and I found this weighty tome, Politics in Arkansas, The Constitutional Experience. Lead author, Hal Ledbetter. George Dyer, Robert Johnston, Wayne Swanson, Walter Nunn. In it, you are indicted as one of the leaders of the 1970 commission. You were not rated in the top 20 going into the convention, but I'm not sure exactly how they came to this. I haven't plowed through the political science in the middle of the book, but somehow you ended up in the top 20 in the leadership by the end of the show.
Well, that's because I was chairman of the Municipal Government Committee, and all the mayors liked what we did, so they got out pushed for it.
Right. But one of the most useful things here is it's one of the appendixes. It goes through the major points and changes in the Constitution of 1970. Prohibits license or registration, tax or fee on the right to bear arms. Permits but does not require annual sessions of the legislature. 4-year terms for constitutional officers, combining the offices of Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of State. Okay, there's an efficiency expert there. And one of the most interesting is at the end, Article 12, it authorizes a vote of the people each 20 years on whether or not to call a constitutional convention.
I thought that was a little much. If you ever get over the hurdle once, don't ask to do it every 20 years.
Gotcha.
Try to be happy with what you got.
Another few dozen amendments.
Yes.
Well, for the time being, I haven't heard any serious calls for.
Well, some of the things that are so exasperating about this is that what's out there, even in the amendments, the Game and Fish amendment to the Constitution was talked about a little earlier, but even it tied down legislation. It put the amount of the hunting fees in the Constitution. I mean, it's nonsense. But I think it indicates another answer to your question, David, about why did the other one fail. the ones that have been successful have been so minutia, so limited that I can decide I want to vote for a $3 license fee for my hunting license. I mean, I can get that. And I think that's the reason there have been so many amendments, and that the amendments, by and large, have been pretty much successful. The Voting Rights Amendment 51 is a piece of legislation, as you know. It's full of legislation about where you go to the polls, how you elect the poll watchers. That's all legislative. It hadn't got anything to do really with the fundamental operation of government, other than to say you got to have elections. But people can get that. We can, okay, yeah, I think we need to have it. You can read that one because it's only about maybe 3 pages, not that long. You can grasp that. And I think that's why constitutional amendments have been so successful. 100, what do we got, 102, 100, you told me 100?
102 at present.
Yeah, okay, well.
And more in the offing.
We'll keep counting. But you can decide today whether this may not be the best example that came out, whether you want to repeal the casino amendment that you passed 2 or 3 years ago or not. I mean, you can decide that, yes or no. But it's very hard to decide a document that has, I've forgotten how many sections to it. On the 96 convention, I know had 25 or 30 separate sections that you have to digest. And I think that's why the people just can't digest it. They can digest these simple things about what I want my hunting license to be.
Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions for Mr. Gill? Can it be resubmitted? Or is there any possibility of that?
Oh, yes, it definitely could. The legislature could take any one of these proposals, the 70, the 80, or the 96, and say, okay, folks, let's vote on it again. Well, I say that real quickly. Most of that is still very prominent. In fact, I haven't seen the list, and I don't know when, if ever, it's really had been analyzed entirely. Many of the things in the 70 convention, the 80 convention, and the 96 proposal have been adopted since. They have served, if there's any benefit for the constitutional conventions and what Governor Tucker did, if there's any real benefit from that is, it laid out a roadmap for legislatures to come behind it or individuals to come behind it with initiated acts and get it into the Constitution. Someday when I haven't got anything else to do, I may try to sit down and see if I can figure out how many of those proposals came forward, but a large number did. A large number of them are in the Constitution today, or in, well, a lot of the ethics information is in statutes now that arose out of what we were trying to do in some of the constitutions. So there's legislation and there's constitutional amendments that have tracked what these groups have done ever since 1970. And I think that's the great benefit of all this effort, frankly. We didn't get it done entirely, but we've done a pretty good job of it piecemeal. Still dealing with some things that drive you nuts, but then the long part of it is it's a better, the Constitution, I would say Constitution as amended today is a far better document than it was in 1968 when you got into the first one of these conventions. Far better document. It doesn't read as well, it doesn't look as well, you got to flip the page and back and forth and whatnot, but the substance of the law left up to the fine bunch of lawyers like you had up here a few minutes ago can sort it out, but it's there, it's written, and it can be interpreted if you can get past some of the archaic provisions that still pop up ever so often. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing that I've always thought was fun. I don't know exactly how this is still in the Constitution, but what the 96 effort did was eliminate secret sessions of the legislature. believe it or not, the Constitution provided up to that point for secret sessions. They've changed that by law now. I have not tried to evaluate whether the law has come in conflict with the Constitution. It says you can have secret sessions, but I ain't going down that road.
No. Okay. There are no further questions?
Let me close,
All right.
and thank you for putting this together. I'm supposed to know a little bit. I'm supposed to know a little something about the Constitution, but I've learned a whole lot today, thanks to you and thanks to these presenters. And I think you've done a great job, and do it again.
Thank you, sir. And thank you all for being a great audience. And thank you. Spread the word. The Constitution. It's not just there to wonder whether or not it exists. It's there to read and at least scratch your head at. And if you need to see the original, come down. My office isn't that hard to find. So thank you all very much, and hope to see you again.